when we're talking here indigenous with a capital I, and I'm very important about this because you can say you can have an indigenous plant, which means it's local to a region, or you can have and we can use indigenous with a small I. But when we talk about indigenous communities, we're talking about those communities that are now minorities in lands that were once theirs. There are peoples who have been displaced by a colonial or a conquest tradition. So we're talking the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders of Australia, the Indians of America, First Nations in Canada, the Ainu in Japan, the Sami in Finland, Norway, in Scandinavia and Sweden. These are all indigenous peoples, by which we mean the original inhabitants of a land, of a region, that goes back to what you might call the ancient of days. Indeed, in Australia, we used to think it was 40,000 years that the Aboriginal peoples were here and held this land before the coming of the white invasion. It now turns out to be more like 60,000 years. So from time out of mind, these were inhabitants who in fairly recent times, since European expansion from the 16th century and beyond, have been completely displaced. So the Incas and the Aztecs would be the indigenous peoples of Peru and of Mexico, and so on. Now, indigenous entrepreneurship, therefore, is very simply about doing entrepreneurship in indigenous contexts. But that's simple to state, but it's complex to get right, because these communities now have been so degraded by the colonial and the conquest experience, which was followed almost worldwide by the phenomenon of what we call the passive welfare system, that these communities are now absolutely so poor in rich countries and so relatively deprived that they form a very special group within those countries. So, you know, we could talk a long time, but most of people watching this will be well aware that the standard of living, the income of an Australian Aboriginal in a community is infinitely less, is substantially less than it is for a person in what you call the mainstream. So indigenous entrepreneurship is about getting the context of indigeneity understood if we're going to do entrepreneurship, because what you cannot do is to just simply take what we would use in advanced Western democracies like Denmark, Australia, the United States, France, wherever, and expect that we can use those models, those business models, those teaching models, and have them work, because the context is so different and so complex that you have to very specifically deal with it. And I think the case clearly brings that to the fore.